Good afternoon, nice to see you all. I hope you're all staying safe and well. Welcome back to another video tutorial with me, Mr. Davis. In today's lesson we are looking at Animal Farm Chapter 8 and as the title suggests we're going to be focusing on the allegory. We're going to be looking at totalitarianism in the novel, particularly the cult of personality, censorship and the use of violence and misinformation to create a intimidating totalitarian state that oppresses the animals. You'll notice that the animals are becoming, especially the pigs, are becoming increasingly corrupt. By the end of the chapter they are drinking alcohol, so another breach of the 7 commandments there. And this chapter is also a very important one because it includes the Battle of the Windmill, which we'll talk about later on. So what was going to, again, just to remind you, you have to have read the chapter first. It will make it far more impactful for you. What we'll do first is we'll look at a summary of the chapter, and then I'll go through the allegory first, and then we'll look at the elements of totalitarianism in this chapter. But just to make it really clear and kind of just to emphasize the point here, we saw in chapter 7 the ultimate betrayal of the revolution, really, with the animals, with Napoleon having put the animals who were seen as rebellious or as dissenters, having put them to death, which is of course a breach of one of the 7 commandments, the idea that no animal should kill another animal. So this chapter rather describes the further descent into totalitarianism that takes place on Animal Farm. Okay, on your screens now is a very short summary of chapter 8. I'll give you a bit of time to have a read. Okay, so the first significant event in terms of the allegory that I want to explore is the pig's censorship of the 6th commandment that used to read no animal shall kill any other animal, and then is mysteriously edited to contain the words without cause. And this is of course a powerful criticism from Orwell of the corruption of the values imparted by Lenin and Marx in the Russian Revolution, and how essentially Stalin corrupted the values of communism and betrayed the revolution of 1917. So that, of course, if some animals can kill other animals, that implies that there is no longer an equal it's no longer an equal society, that some are more powerful than others, and also obviously that there are no human rights or no freedoms in this society. Most importantly, it links back to how, just like Farmer Jones was able to fire his rifle to gain control, and just like Tsar Nicholas II was able to use violence to control his people, that kind of leadership has now returned. So that oppressive, violent leadership has returned to Animal Farm and to Russia. So this is an allegory of the corruption of communism that took place under Joseph Stalin, and that's the kind of significance behind this example of censorship. The next part of the chapter, especially the opening stages of chapter 8, are really satirical. So it's really mocking and full of kind of irony in its description of the pigs, particularly Squealer and Napoleon, who's on your screen. Squealer spends his time reading out long lists of figures, which is an allegory for how the Soviet Union used to invent figures to exaggerate how productive and efficient their system was. And Napoleon is now more or less a kind of talisman. He spends his time in isolation, in separate apartments to the other animals. He's become increasingly paranoid. And I think there's a satirical edge to Orwell's description. I think he's very much mocking the mocking the dictator figure. That is, of course, the allegory for Joseph Stalin. Napoleon rarely appears in public anymore. He's always surrounded by a retinue of dogs. He is living in separate apartments from other animals. He has his food tasted for him before every meal, which is a sign of paranoia. So there's so many examples of mockery of Joseph Stalin in the descriptions. I think best of all for me, in terms of the satire, is the description of the titles. So Napoleon is self-described now as being our leader, Comrade Napoleon, the father of all animals, the terror of mankind, the protector of the sheepfold, the duckling's friend. So he has all of these ridiculous self-appointed titles that essentially are used to make him, or to present him as being incredibly egotistical, incredibly arrogant, incredibly deluded, and kind of interestingly, in terms of the characterization, it's as if the character of Napoleon is starting to believe his own myth. But all of these metaphors, you know, the father of all animals, the terror of mankind, all of these metaphors speak to how deep-rooted now the cult of personality of Napoleon has become, how he is seen as a godlike figure. And this is an example of satire because it's clearly mocking. It's clearly an example of Orwell using the character of Napoleon to make fun of and poke fun at Joseph Stalin. And here are a couple of the titles that Stalin himself actually had. So this is the allegory behind Napoleon's title. So as you can see, some of the titles are eerily similar. Father of nations, father of all animals. All of these kind of metaphorical titles are clearly based on the titles that Stalin himself had at the time that Animal Farm was written. And again, remember that the kind of intention of Orwell when he wrote this novel was to warn and critique, to warn other countries about Stalinism, but also to critique Stalinism and to expose Stalinism as being a corrupt system. And this biting satire is emphasised with the song composed by Minimus the pig called Comrade Napoleon, which is clearly an allegory of all the songs dedicated to Stalin when he was the ruler of the Soviet Union. Next up, in terms of the allegory, we have the references to more confessions, which we talked about last lesson, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this. But we have this idea of the gander confessing his guilt on page 70 and these show trials, which we've talked about previously. We then have the building finally, or the rebuilding I should say, of the windmill. And we talked about how the windmill is a symbol for progress, it's a symbol for innovation, it's a symbol for the transformation that's taken place since the expulsion of Farmer Jones, but it's also an allegory for Stalin's 5-year plans and these really ambitious social transformations, these policies that would transform Russia from being an agrarian society to being an industrial one. But they obviously put a huge amount of pressure on the Russian people, and millions died as a result from starvation and from overwork and from the brutal conditions of that period. And it's interesting now that the windmill, which was a symbol of essentially of hope initially in the novel, its meaning has now definitely changed. It's now called Napoleon Mill. So the meaning behind this motif has shifted, and it becomes a symbol of tyranny and of dictatorship eventually. And finally, perhaps most importantly in the chapter, in fact certainly most importantly in the chapter, we have the allegory of Napoleon's treatment of Pilkington and Frederick. And you would notice as you read the chapter that he shifts between his allegiances shift. So one minute he's in alliance with Pilkington, the next with Frederick. And this is an allegory for Stalin's relationship with the Western democracies of the US and Britain in the character of Pilkington, and then in Frederick with his relationship with Hitler. And we talked about how Stalin signed that non-aggression pact with Hitler initially. And of course this chapter marks the betrayal. So in this chapter we have the invasion of Animal Farm, which becomes known as the Battle of the Windmill. And this is a hugely significant event. This is the attack on Animal Farm by Mr. Frederick and his men. And it culminates in a brutal, savage and bitter battle. And in the death of many animals and some of the human beings as well. It's the first battle where there were actual casualties on both sides. And And this really brutal, sudden and savage battle results in even Napoleon getting involved and getting injured, being wounded. And we'll talk about the aftermath of the battle afterwards. But it's a hugely significant moment because it's come on the back of so many tragedies on Animal Farm and so much misery that you notice that it's not celebrated in the same way as the Battle of the Cowshed was. So this battle, the Battle of the Windmill, is an allegory for this event, and I'll show you a picture of that on my screen. We've talked about this before. This is an image from Operation Barbarossa. This is Hitler's plan to invade Russia using a blitzkrieg strategy, which is essentially a kind of incredibly fast-paced and incredibly violent all-out attack on the Russian people and on the Russian army. It was a very sudden, very successful initially invasion until they got held up at Stalingrad, which became a very famous siege, which ended because of the Russian winters, and that Hitler's attempt to invade Russia was actually foiled by the Russian winters and the lack of preparation that the lack of equipment the Nazi soldiers had. So Operation Barbarossa is an incredibly significant event in history. Had Hitler been successful, maybe the war would have swung a different way. But it's very important that this is what Orwell is referring to in the Battle of the Windmill. This battle is between the deceitful Mr. Frederick, who is obviously an allegory of Hitler, who stuns the animals with a surprise attack, and the animals have to literally give it everything they've got in order to win the battle. And this goes back to Operation Barbarossa and the Russian fatalities in World War I, which were huge. I mean, 27 million Russians or Soviets lost their lives in World War II, fighting the Germans. So it links to this incredibly important event in Russian history, where they came within a brink of collapsing to the Germans, but also it reminds us of the fact that the fact that the Germans were pushed back, the fact that the Red Army launched a counterattack and actually ended up in Berlin. It reminds us of how high and how well esteemed, how highly esteemed Stalin was at the time this book was written. Remember, he is the man who helped to defeat the Germans, and that image of him as being a war hero and a kind of saviour of the Allied countries is what Orwell is writing about. He's trying to challenge that image of Stalin. And that brings me back to the windmill, which of course is destroyed. And I talked about how the windmill is a symbol of progress, it's a symbol of industrialisation, a symbol of modernity, and the fact that it's destroyed suggests that all of the changes that the animals have made have been knocked back. So it's about the fact that they've lost the progress that they tried to make. They've lost momentum, and it's a hugely important moment, the collapse of the windmill, the destruction of the windmill, because it represents their hopes and dreams being shattered, and it similarly represents how, on an allegorical level, it represents how Russia was utterly destroyed by the Second World War, how it cost so many lives, but also it was devastating in terms of the infrastructure and the burning of farmland, etc., that took place during Operation Barbarossa. And we talked about the cyclical elements to the narrative structure last lesson. It's interesting, the cyclical elements to this the structure of chapter 8 is also interesting, because early in the novel they'd celebrated the Battle of the Cowshed as a great victory, but this victory is far more muted. They're described as weary and bleeding, and even Boxer asks, why are we celebrating? What victory are we actually celebrating? Because of course Russia lost so many millions of people in the Second World War, it hardly felt like a victory when it was over. That's the kind of allegory of that piece of writing, the idea that the Russians had sacrificed too much in the victory of World War II. And the final allegorical event I'd like to talk about is right at the end of the chapter, where Squealer is kind of caught having changed the paintwork on the side of the barn to "no animal shall drink alcohol," and he's added the words "to excess." And I just want to talk about the allegory of the drinking and why the pigs take so much pleasure in alcohol. Again, I think it's going back to the allegory of the corruption of the leadership of Russia during Stalin's reign. The idea that they were hypocrites. They would prohibit certain things as being, banned, and yet they would do them secretively. So it's about the hypocrisy of the people who ran Russia. It's about the hypocrisy of the Communist Party in Russia, and also the hypocrisy of Stalin himself. The fact that he portrays himself as a god, as someone who has all of these virtues, but in actuality, he drinks to excess. He's becoming more and more like Farmer Jones. So that's the allegory of that passage there. Let's have a checkpoint on allegory, and then we'll talk more about the totalitarian nature of Animal Farm at this point in the novel. Time for our first checkpoint. Your questions are on the board in front of you. Please follow the suggested timings, and please write in full sentences, and I'll see you shortly. Welcome back. I thought we would finish today's lesson by discussing the ending of the chapter, in which Squealer is seen having fallen from the ladder with a paintbrush and an overturned pot of white paint, and he's edited the commandments to no animal shall drink alcohol to excess. And we talked a little bit already about how the pigs are essentially slowly brainwashing the animals through spreading misinformation, through rewriting history, and through trying to change their collective memory. And they're using, or I suppose exploiting, the stupidity of the other animals and their illiteracy to essentially break the rules that they've created and get away with it. And this is another example of that. We've already had the commandment of no animal shall kill any other animal being edited and changed, and now this one as well. This commandment represents the corruption of the pigs, I would argue. It represents the fact that they're taking up Farmer Jones's worst vice. Remember that he was described initially at the beginning of the novel as a drunkard, and it's the fact that the pigs have taken up alcohol really does emphasize this cyclical structure to the novel, that history again is repeating itself, that this rebellion has only caused a worse type of society to rise up, and that society is of course totalitarian. And the fact that the pigs enjoy to drink heavily, and the fact that they clearly are drinking to excess themselves, which is kind of satirized by the declaration of Napoleon dying towards the end of the chapter, but he's actually only just got a hangover. This again emphasizes the corruption of the pigs and their betrayal of the revolution. It's particularly significant that towards the end of the chapter, it's revealed to the reader that Napoleon has given orders that the paddock beyond the orchard is to be turned into a field, and it's revealed that Napoleon has the intention to sow barley, which is of course one of the key crops used to make beer or to make alcohol as well. And this is really significant because that paddock that is going to be used as a field to grow barley, that was supposed to be the retirement home for animals that had worked their whole lives and earned their retirement. And the fact that Napoleon is taking that away from the other animals suggests that they will never have a retirement, that they're going to be worked to death, that there is no kind of golden future. Remember that characters like Benjamin and Boxer have been looking forward to spending their old age on this kind of ideal, idyllic paddock. And now Napoleon is taking that away, and that just represents again this idea of the corruption of the revolution, the betrayal of its values, and again essentially the idea that history has repeated itself, but only the replacement society is actually worse than the initial one. So the Soviet Union is a worse and more oppressive society than Tsar Nicholas's Russia. Okay, that marks the end of our lesson today on Chapter 8. Join me next time for Chapter 9, which will probably be over 2 parts. Make sure you stay safe and well, and complete your independent tasks now. So see you next time, and goodbye.